In the heart of ancient India, during a time of remarkable philosophical unrest and spiritual hunger, a man named Siddhartha Gautama walked the dusty roads barefoot, not as a conqueror, not as a prophet, and not as a scribe, but as a seeker who had seen through the veils of existence. He came to be known as the Buddha, the Awakened One. Yet, in a world where kings carved edicts into stone, poets immortalized verses on palm leaves, and sages etched sacred mantras into copper plates, the Buddha made an unusual choice. He wrote nothing down. Not a single scroll, leaf, or inscription bears the handwriting of the Buddha. To the modern mind, raised on libraries, search engines, and instant access to information, this decision may seem puzzling, even irresponsible. How could the founder of a world religion leave no written record of his teachings? Wouldn't writing them down preserve their purity and prevent distortion? Could it be that something deeper was at play, something far more powerful than the written word? This story is not merely a historical inquiry. It is an exploration of a spiritual decision that defies modern logic. For over 4 centuries after the Buddha's passing, his teachings were passed entirely by word of mouth, memorized, chanted, debated, and transmitted with astonishing accuracy by generations of monks. It wasn't until the 1st century BCE, in the island kingdom of Sri Lanka, that the words of the Buddha were finally committed to writing under extraordinary circumstances. But why the delay? Why such confidence in oral tradition over written scripture? Was it simply due to a lack of literacy or materials? Or did the Buddha understand something profound about the nature of truth, memory, and liberation? In this long-form story, we journey deep into the mind of a tradition that dared to preserve impermanence through the human voice. We will explore the historical context, writing in ancient India and the Buddha's relationship to it, the psychological and spiritual rationale for choosing oral over written transmission, how memory, repetition, and collective recitation formed a living, breathing scripture, the turning point, why and how the Pali canon was finally written down, the implications for truth, language, and transmission in a world now dominated by text and technology. This is not just a tale of ancient monks and fading chants. It is a meditation on the power of the spoken word, the fragility of the written, and the essence of what can truly be called knowledge. For in the silence of what was never written lies perhaps the deepest teaching of all. To understand why the Buddha never wrote down his teachings, we must first let go of our modern assumptions. We live in an age where writing is everywhere, etched on screens, paper, stone, and memory cards. Words are preserved with a keystroke, duplicated endlessly, and archived across the world in digital clouds. But in the 5th century BCE, writing was not the cornerstone of civilization. It was a rare, elite, and distrusted tool. And in the world into which Siddhartha Gautama was born, the human voice carried far more power than the written word. The region that would come to be known as northern India was a vibrant landscape of kingdoms, forest hermitages, and wandering ascetics. The spiritual and intellectual atmosphere of this time was charged with inquiry. Dozens of sects flourished, offering conflicting visions of reality, the soul, the gods, and the path to liberation. Amid this swirl of teachings, it was not writing but memory that ruled. The most respected teachers were not those who could read or write, but those who could recite entire treatises, sometimes hours long, from memory. The Vedas, the ancient sacred hymns of the Brahmins, had already been passed down orally for centuries, preserved with painstaking accuracy through strict memorization techniques. Recitation was considered purer than writing. Writing was cold, fixed, and potentially dangerous. It could be corrupted, misread, misunderstood. The spoken word, on the other hand, was alive, carried from breath to breath, heart to heart, teacher to student. Siddhartha Gautama was born into this world, a prince by birth, but a seeker by destiny. When he left the palace and began his spiritual quest, he entered a culture where literacy was neither common nor necessary for truth-seeking. The few who could write, scribes, accountants, or court officials, were seen as tools of administration, not carriers of wisdom. Even among philosophers and sages, writing was viewed with suspicion. Some feared that sacred truths, once written down, would lose their vitality, fall into the hands of the unworthy, or be distorted by interpretation. What mattered most was living transmission, the eye-to-eye, voice-to-ear passage of wisdom from one awakened mind to another. So when the Buddha attained enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree and later began to teach, It was entirely natural for his message to be spoken, not written. He taught in the vernacular languages of the people, not the elite Sanskrit of the Brahmins. His words were intended to be heard, contemplated, and practiced, not studied in isolation from parchment. He wandered from village to village, field to forest, always accompanied by monks who listened closely, memorized carefully, and repeated diligently. This was not a careless or unstructured process. The early Buddhist community developed a highly disciplined oral tradition. Teachings were often given in repetitive, rhythmic, and formulaic structures, not by accident, but by design. Phrases like "this was said by the Blessed One," or "thus have I heard," marked the beginning of many teachings, serving as verbal bookmarks. Lists of 3, 4, 5, or more concepts, like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the 5 aggregates, were used constantly, functioning like mnemonic scaffolding. Entire suttas, discourses, were built with chanted rhythms, almost like poetic mantras, allowing monks to retain them with stunning precision. We must not imagine this oral system as crude or vulnerable. In truth, it was astonishingly reliable. The training of monks included deep memory work, daily recitation, group chanting, and correction through community consensus. A monk did not claim to know a teaching unless he had received it directly from a reliable elder and had confirmed it through repeated verification. When disagreements arose about the wording of a sutta, the Sangha monastic community would gather to recite and reach consensus. In this way, the teachings were not only preserved, they were lived, embodied in community, constantly reviewed and refined. Moreover, the very nature of the Buddha's message lent itself to oral preservation. He was not delivering dogma, nor was he offering static scriptures. His teachings were practical, experiential, and adaptable. He often tailored his message to the needs of his audience, sometimes explaining deep concepts through metaphors, sometimes offering silence when words would be a barrier. To write down a fixed version of such a living, breathing teaching might have reduced its power. Like a river, the Dhamma flowed, always the same in essence, but constantly adapting to the terrain through which it passed. There is also a deeper psychological reason why the Buddha may have chosen not to write. Writing externalizes knowledge. It removes it from the immediacy of the present moment. But the Buddha's entire path pointed inward, toward direct, mindful observation of reality as it is, here and now. He warned against attachment to views, to concepts, to language itself. What he taught was not a doctrine to be remembered, but a path to be walked. By refusing to write, he ensured that his followers would never mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. As centuries passed, the Buddha's silence on writing became part of the tradition itself. The oral teachings were considered not a weakness but a strength, a sign of integrity, flexibility, and communal trust. To be part of the Sangha meant to take part in a vast network of memory, responsibility, and living transmission. The teachings survived not because they were written down, but because they were remembered in the body and spirit of those who lived them. It would be nearly 400 years before this living river would be dammed into text. But even then, it was not because the tradition had failed, it was because the world around it had changed. In the chapters to come, we will follow this evolution, how a teaching born of silence and breath eventually found itself etched into palm leaves, how oral perfection turned into written preservation, and what was gained and lost in the process. But to understand the significance of that transition, we must always return here, to this world without books, where truth was carried not by ink but by the human voice. A world where nothing was written, and yet nothing was forgotten. When the Buddha passed into Parinibbana beneath the twin sala trees of Kusinara, he left behind no tomb, no final written testament, and no appointed successor. What he left behind was a living community, a Sangha composed of men and women who had walked the path alongside him, who had heard his voice not from a book but through direct experience. The question now is simple, yet daunting. How could the teachings of an awakened one be preserved without a single word on parchment? The answer lay not in writing, but in the collective voice of the monastic community. In the immediate aftermath of the Buddha's death, a great council, known as the First Buddhist Council, was convened at Rajagaha. 500 arahants gathered, not to grieve, but to recite and standardize the teachings. The central figure in this effort was Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant for over 20 years. Though he had not yet attained arahantship at the time of the Buddha's death, Ananda was said to have remembered every word the Buddha spoke. His mind was a vast library, not written in ink, but engraved in memory. His role at the council was to begin each discourse with the famous phrase, "Eva Sutta, thus have I heard." These words marked not only a narrative introduction, but a spiritual seal of authenticity. They reminded the community that what was being passed on was not doctrine, but a memory alive in the moment, heard, understood, and realized. Each sutta was recited aloud, discussed, and confirmed by other monks who had heard the same teachings. The Vinaya, the monastic code, was likewise recited by Pali, another close disciple, and verified collectively. What emerged was a remarkable feat, the oral codification of an entire spiritual system, stored not in temples or scrolls, but in minds trained like steel traps. How was this even possible? The answer lies in the rigorous oral training and cultural values of the time. From a young age, monks were trained in methods of memorization that have all but vanished in our modern world. The texts themselves were designed for memory, repetitive phrases, patterned structures, numerical lists, and rhythmic cadences made the teachings easier to retain. Take, for example, the frequent use of numbered categories, the 3 characteristics, the 4 noble truths, the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, the 8-fold path, the 9 abidings of meditation, the 10 fetters. These weren't arbitrary. They were cognitive tools, mnemonics disguised as doctrine. But even more powerful than memory techniques was communal recitation. The Sangha did not rely on solitary monks carrying individual versions of the teachings. Instead, recitation was a daily, communal activity. At dawn and dusk, monks would gather and chant the suttas together, sometimes in unison, sometimes in call and response form. In this way, errors were corrected in real time, and variations were harmonized through consensus. No single voice could alter the Dhamma. The Sangha itself became the guardian of the word. This communal structure created a system of checks and balances more robust than any written archive. A written document can be lost, burned, or misinterpreted, but a living tradition, echoed in hundreds of voices across multiple regions, is self-replicating. Even if one monastery fell, another would still carry the flame. In many ways, this oral network was more resilient than written text because it was embedded in people, not things. There is also a deeper dimension to why the Sangha preserved the teachings so faithfully. These were not just monks memorizing dogma. For many, the Dhamma was not something external to be remembered. It was something they had verified through their own experience. When a monk recited a sutta on impermanence, he was not repeating empty words. He was reaffirming truths he had seen directly in his own mind and body. This embodied memory created a kind of transmission that was both intellectual and existential. In such a context, forgetting a line was not merely an error, it was a break in living truth. Furthermore, the Buddha's teachings were not only preserved, they were often re-explained, expanded, and cross-referenced through a body of commentarial oral traditions. Monks discussed the meanings of suttas, the nuances of Pali terms, the implications of certain metaphors. They told Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's past lives, to illustrate moral lessons. They debated the Vinaya rules in practical situations. In doing so, they ensured that the Dhamma was not frozen in form, but continuously reborn through understanding. What's more astonishing is that this system worked, not for a few decades, but for more than 400 years. Generation after generation of monks continued this oral transmission across vast distances. India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, long before a single line was ever written down. Archaeological and textual studies confirm that the early suttas were passed with remarkable consistency, with only minor regional variations. This endurance was not a miracle. It was the fruit of discipline, community, and deep spiritual commitment. The modern reader may still ask, but wouldn't writing have made things easier? Perhaps. But the Buddha was not interested in ease. He was interested in awakening. The oral transmission, for all its demands, required a level of mindfulness, attentiveness, and communal harmony that mirrored the very path the Buddha taught. The monks who preserved his words did so not as scribes, but as practitioners, living vessels of wisdom, not merely containers of facts. To preserve the Dhamma was to embody it. And in that embodiment, the voice became scripture, the chant became canon, and the memory of one became the memory of many. In the next chapter, we will explore how this river of memory, flowing undisturbed for centuries, finally met a turning point, a moment of crisis in a distant land. when the oral tradition would be forced to choose between silence and survival. And for the first time in history, the voice of the Buddha would be captured not in breath, but in ink. For over 4 centuries, the Dhamma flowed from voice to voice, sustained not by books or ink, but by memory, practice, and community. It traversed forests, kingdoms, and generations, adjusting its tone but never its essence. And then, in the distant island of Lanka, known today as Sri Lanka, a storm began to gather. One that would shake the foundations of this oral tradition to its core. The voice of the Buddha, alive for centuries in human breath, faced a terrifying possibility. It might be lost forever. The events unfolded in the 1st century BCE during the reign of King Vagmayabhya. Sri Lanka at this time had become a thriving center of Theravada Buddhism, thanks to the missionary efforts sent by Emperor Asoka centuries earlier. The Pali canon, though still unwritten, was fully alive, preserved with discipline and dedication by the island's monastic communities. The most famous of these was the Mahavihara in Anuradhapura, a grand monastic center where hundreds of monks studied, practiced, and recited the teachings daily. But the land was not at peace. Political instability, foreign invasions, and internal conflicts erupted like cracks in a fragile vase. The most devastating blow came when Tamil invaders from South India swept into the island, seizing control and forcing the Buddhist monks to scatter into remote forests and caves. The once orderly rhythm of communal recitation broke. Monks were killed, driven into hiding, or forced to abandon the daily rituals that had kept the oral tradition alive for centuries. And then came the famines. Waves of crop failure brought starvation to the island. The monastic communities, already fragmented, began to collapse. Monks weakened by hunger could no longer meet to chant. Some fled, some died, and with them, entire portions of the oral canon were at risk of disappearing, not because they were lost on paper, but because the people who carried them inside were disappearing. This was the turning point. For the first time, the leaders of the Sangha faced an existential question. What happens to the Dhamma when no one is left to remember it? It was not a philosophical question. It was a matter of spiritual survival. The teachings, so carefully guarded for centuries through oral transmission, now teetered on the edge of extinction. And so, with great reluctance and urgency, the decision was made. The Dhamma must be written down. It was not a celebration. It was a mourning. According to the ancient chronicles, the task of preserving the scriptures in written form was undertaken at Alivihara, a rock monastery in the central highlands of Sri Lanka. It was a natural fortress, remote, quiet, and protected, an ideal place to inscribe the sacred words far from the chaos consuming the rest of the island. Monks gathered there, those who still remembered the suttas and Vinaya, who had carried the Dhamma in their minds like torches through darkness. But this was no ordinary writing session. These monks were not scribes by trade. They were guardians of a flame, now transferring it from living breath to fragile palm leaves. With styluses carved from bone or metal, they began the immense task of writing down the Pali canon, the Tipiyaka, or 3 baskets, the Vinaya Piyaka, monastic code, the Sutta Piyaka, discourses, and the Abhidhamma Piyaka, systematic philosophy. Every word was copied with care, deliberation, and often with tears. For to write the Dhamma was to admit that the living chain had been broken. And yet, in that act of desperation, something extraordinary happened. The teachings, once ephemeral, passed from throat to throat, became tangible, enduring, and portable. For the first time, the Dhamma could survive even if no monk survived. A leaf could carry what no memory could. A library could endure where a single voice might fail. But the transition came at a cost. The written word, for all its advantages, lacks something the oral tradition carried by nature: intimacy, immediacy, and adaptability. A living teaching is not fixed. It breathes, evolves, shifts with the needs of the listener. A written text, by contrast, is rigid. It cannot respond to the moment. It cannot correct itself unless someone rewrites it. It can be copied incorrectly, interpreted mistakenly, or idolized as an object rather than a path. The monks of Alivihara knew this. They did not believe they were improving the tradition. They were preserving its corpse, hoping that future generations might breathe life back into it through practice. In fact, even after the scriptures were written down, oral recitation never ceased. The written texts became a backup, a reference, a safety net. But the living tradition continued. with monks still memorizing vast portions of the canon, still gathering in groups to chant under moonlight and firelight. In some monasteries, especially in the forest traditions, this oral recitation continues even today. What was written at a Luvahara became one of the great spiritual treasures of the world. The Pali Canon, as preserved in Sri Lanka, is the oldest complete collection of Buddhist scriptures in existence. It forms the foundation of Theravada Buddhism and is revered in countries from Myanmar and Thailand to Cambodia and Laos. But it remains, in its heart, a record of what was once spoken, a frozen river that once flowed. It is ironic and beautiful that the very act meant to prevent the teachings from vanishing, the writing of the scriptures, has now led to their study in silent libraries on glowing screens, in academic seminars. And yet, the true Dhamma remains unchanged. As the Buddha said, whoever sees the Dhamma sees me, not on paper, not on a palm leaf, but in direct, mindful experience. The crisis in Lanka did not destroy the Dhamma. It transformed it. It reminded the world that even impermanence can be preserved, if not in voice, then in text. But the text, no matter how sacred, is only a map. The path must still be walked. In the next chapter, we will reflect on the deeper implications of this transformation. What does it mean to know something when it is written versus when it is spoken? How does the medium of transmission shape the message, and even the mind of the one receiving it? For in that shift, from voice to text, from living memory to physical preservation, something essential was both saved and sacrificed. When the teachings of the Buddha were finally written down on fragile palm leaves in the caves of Aluvihara, a monumental shift occurred, one as silent as ink and as subtle as impermanence itself. On the surface, it appeared to be a simple act of preservation. The monks had saved the Dhamma from oblivion. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. The medium had changed. And with it, so too did the mind of the receiver. In oral tradition, a teaching is not something you possess. You do not store it away or collect it like coins or manuscripts. You live with it. Inside it, you memorize it not by reading, but by chanting, repeating, breathing. The sound of the words passes through your vocal cords, your breath, your heartbeat. The Dhamma becomes embodied. Its rhythm stitched into your daily routine. Each word carries tone, emotion, and immediacy. Each teaching is alive in the room, not just an idea, but a presence, transmitted in the moment. Never quite the same twice. But writing changed all of that. Once a sutta is written down, it becomes fixed. Its form is no longer fluid but frozen. It can now be duplicated, transported, stored, and studied, but it can also be distorted, misunderstood, or idolized. The moment it is inked, the Dhamma risks becoming something it was never meant to be, a possession, a sacred object. A doctrine to debate rather than a path to walk. What was once a living voice becomes, in the wrong hands, a lifeless scroll. And yet, the gains were undeniable. With the arrival of writing, the teachings could spread farther than any voice could carry. A monk in the jungles of Sri Lanka could now study the same words as one in the mountains of Burma. Scholars could translate and compare versions, tracing subtle differences, analyzing language, extracting deep layers of meaning. The Dhamma became global, accessible not only to monks but to laypeople, philosophers, and seekers across the world. In time, entire civilizations would come to know the name Buddha because someone had once decided to write down his words. But something else was lost, something harder to name. It is the difference between hearing and reading. To hear a sutta chanted by a monk who has lived and breathed it for years is to receive a vibration, not just a message. You feel the pauses, the breath between lines, the subtle emphasis on certain phrases. You sense the presence of the teaching, not just its content. It enters not only through the eyes of comprehension, but through the ears of experience. When you read a sutta in translation, much of that is gone. You get the meaning, perhaps, but not the mood. You understand the instruction, but maybe not the urgency. The sacred becomes academic. The voice becomes typography. The teaching becomes optional, a line you can highlight, copy, save, but not necessarily embody. And that is the great paradox. What was gained through writing was scale, what was lost was depth. Consider the metaphor the Buddha often used, that his teachings were like a raft, meant to carry you across the river of suffering. Once you've crossed, you don't carry the raft on your back, you let it go. But with written texts, People began building temples to the raft, arguing about its measurements, translating its materials, fighting over which version was more authentic. In some cases, the raft became more revered than the crossing itself. This isn't a fault of writing alone, it is the nature of attachment. And the Buddha warned of this repeatedly. He did not teach in order to be quoted. He taught in order to awaken. His message was one of direct realization. Come and see, not come and study. But when teachings are written, they are easily mistaken for truth itself, rather than a path pointing to truth. Writing also introduced something new into the relationship between teacher and student: distance. In the oral tradition, you learned from someone you knew, a living elder, a wise monk, someone who had walked the path and could guide you through its thorns. But with texts, that connection became abstract. A young novice could now read the Buddha's words without ever encountering someone who had internalized them. The danger? Knowledge without wisdom. Words without transformation. And yet, this danger is not inevitable. It is a matter of how we approach the written Dhamma. If we treat the texts not as sacred relics, but as invitations, if we read slowly, reflect deeply, and return again and again, not to accumulate, but to understand, then the written word can become a powerful companion on the path. The ink can point us back to breath. The page can point us back to presence. But this requires mindfulness. It requires remembering that what we are reading is not the goal. It is a finger pointing to the moon, not the moon itself. Today, countless versions of the Pali canon exist, digitized, translated, printed, even quoted on social media. In some ways, the Buddha's voice has never been more widespread. And yet, perhaps never has it been so easy to ignore the heart of the message. For the Dhamma was never meant to be merely known. It was meant to be realized, lived, dissolved into direct insight. The written word, for all its power, cannot do that for us. It can guide, suggest, illuminate, but it cannot awaken. Only your own mind, stabilized and sharpened through practice, can do that. And so we return to a curious truth. Even after the scriptures were written, the most serious practitioners in every tradition, forest monks, meditation masters, reclusive yogis, continued to rely more on silence, on breath, on experience, than on books. For they knew that the Buddha's voice still echoes, not in the palm leaf, but in the stillness between thoughts, in the awareness that observes, in the moment that sees things as they are. Writing saved the Dhamma, but only practice can awaken it again. In the next chapter, we will explore how modernity, globalization, digital media, and the rebirth of meditation in the West has shaped the way the Buddha's words are received today. Has the written tradition brought us closer to awakening? Or are we once again mistaking the message for the method? The question remains open, and it waits for your own direct answer. The 21st century dawned not with chanting monks beneath Bodhi trees, but with glowing screens, infinite scrolls, and notifications buzzing in people's pockets. The voice that once echoed through forest monasteries and ancient rock caves now appeared in unexpected places: PDF files, mobile apps, YouTube channels, online courses, AI-generated translations, even memes. The Dhamma had entered a new realm, one that the Buddha could never have imagined: the digital world. This transformation was more than technological. It marked a new phase in the long evolution of how the Buddha's teachings are transmitted. Oral memory gave way to manuscripts. Manuscripts gave way to printed books. And now, in the age of pixels and wireless networks, the written word has dissolved into pure data, duplicable, searchable, reinterpreted by algorithms and reposted by anyone, anywhere, at any time. Never before in history has the Dhamma been so accessible. A layperson in London can listen to a Thai forest monk's retreat via livestream. A teenager in Tokyo can download the Pali Canon on their phone. A yoga teacher in New York can read a verse from the Dhammapada while riding the subway. The teachings that once required years of dedication to memorize can now be summoned with a few taps on a screen. The Buddha has, in a sense, gone viral. At first glance, this seems like a triumph. The ancient fear that the Dhamma might be lost, the very reason it was written down centuries ago, has now been utterly reversed. It is not that the teachings are scarce. It is that they are everywhere. There are podcasts dissecting suttas, Reddit forums discussing dependent origination, digital concordances of every Pali word ever recorded. Teachers, both sincere and self-appointed, fill the web with interpretations, commentaries, and guided meditations. And yet, with this explosion of access comes a subtle danger. For while the Dhamma is now more available, it is also more fragmented, decontextualized, and commodified. A TikTok video quoting the Buddha may receive millions of views, but is it pointing toward insight or simply feeding the dopamine loop of online consumption? A well-meaning blog post may cite a verse from the Pali canon, but is the writer grounded in practice or echoing what was echoed? The risk is no longer loss through scarcity, but loss through superficiality. The digital realm thrives on brevity, novelty, and speed, but the Dhamma requires depth, stillness, and patience. Awakening is not a bullet point. Suffering is not solved in a tweet. The Four Noble Truths are not motivational slogans. And mindfulness, despite its marketing, is not just a tool for stress relief. It is a radical confrontation with impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self. When the teachings are stripped from their original context, removed from the framework of ethical discipline, meditative depth, and wisdom, they risk becoming just another lifestyle brand. Enlightenment becomes a buzzword. Mindfulness becomes a productivity hack. And the Buddha becomes not a human who awakened, but a symbol to be monetized. Yet all is not lost. There are those who use the digital world as a bridge, not a destination. Monastics offering Dhamma talks on Zoom without charging a fee. Forest monks uploading teachings recorded in the stillness of caves. Scholars translating Pali texts with humility and care, making them freely available online. Meditation communities hosting global retreats where silence and sincerity replace slogans. In these efforts, the digital becomes a servant of the sacred, not its master. Moreover, the internet has enabled a reunion of traditions once separated by geography and language. Theravada practitioners in Sri Lanka can dialogue with Mahayana scholars in Korea. Tibetan yogis can read early Pali suttas in English. Western practitioners can discover the original, unembellished teachings that predate centuries of commentary. For the first time, seekers across the globe can trace the Dhamma back to its roots. But even in this abundance, the core principle remains unchanged. The Dhamma is not learned, it is lived. No number of bookmarked suttas or watched lectures can substitute for the direct work of mindfulness, investigation, and letting go. Just as ink once risked freezing the teachings, the digital age risks flattening them into information. But the Dhamma was never about information. It is about transformation. It was once said that the Buddha never wrote down a single word because the true Dhamma cannot be captured. It must be seen, tasted, realized. That truth has not changed, even if the medium has. The voice of the Buddha may now arrive through a headphone instead of a monk's lips, but the responsibility is still ours, to not mistake hearing for knowing or access for wisdom. In this new age, each of us becomes a guardian of the voice, not by uploading more content, but by living more deeply, by returning again and again to the still point where teachings become truth, not on the screen, but in your own direct experience. In the next and final chapter, we will return to the beginning, to the mystery of why the Buddha, despite his vast wisdom and foresight, chose never to write. We will look beyond history, beyond practicality, to explore the profound spiritual implications of this silence and what it reveals about the nature of true transmission. He could have. There is no doubt. The Buddha born as Siddhartha Gautama was not a simple man lost in the forests of ancient India. He was born into privilege, trained in logic, philosophy, and statecraft. After his awakening, he taught kings and sages, debated with brilliant thinkers, and established an ethical, psychological, and philosophical system so profound that it still astonishes scholars today. If he had wanted to preserve his teachings in written form, he certainly could have. And yet, he never wrote a single word, not a sutta, not a verse, not even a signature scratched into bark or stone. Instead, he entrusted his entire legacy to something infinitely more fragile: the human voice. Why? The answer, like the Dhamma itself, does not lie on the surface. It waits beneath the question. It must be lived to be seen. But we can approach it gently, by turning not to the intellect, but to the living experience of how the Dhamma works. The Buddha knew that truth, ultimate truth, is not something that can be captured in marks on a page. It is not a concept to be transferred. It is an experience that must arise. To realize anatta, non-self, to see the impermanence of all things anicca. To feel the deep unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, at the heart of clinging, this cannot be done through reading alone. It happens in the silence of direct observation, in the quiet fire of meditative insight. Writing, for all its power, creates distance. The written word speaks to the analytical mind, the discursive intellect. It freezes a moment in time. It invites interpretation and invites doubt. But the Dhamma, when transmitted orally, heart to heart, is alive. It breathes. It responds to the listener, the moment, the need. It transforms not because of what it says, but because of how it is received. That is why the Buddha never wrote. Because what he offered was not information, it was liberation. He once said, "One who sees the Dhamma sees me." That seeing is not through eyes scanning a scroll. It is the moment of awakening in the mind that has let go of craving. The Buddha is not found in books. He is found in insight, in the mind that becomes still and sees clearly. Even more profoundly, writing carries the danger of attachment. Words, once written, become objects of reverence. They are copied, enshrined, and worshipped. But the Buddha did not want worship. He wanted clarity. He knew that attachment to even the Dhamma was still attachment. That is why he taught the famous lesson of the raft. The teachings are a tool to cross the river of suffering, not something to carry forever on your back. If the teachings were written, they risked becoming idols, sacred in form, but inert in function. By refusing to write, the Buddha preserved something deeper, a living tradition, a dynamic, relational mode of teaching where wisdom was not memorized, but awakened, where students could ask questions, express doubt, and receive guidance tailored to their situation, where the Dhamma was not fixed in ink, but born anew in each encounter. This is why the early monks preserved the teachings in rhythmic meter, using repetition and structure, not just for memory's sake, but to keep the Dhamma oral, relational, and alive. When you chant a sutta, you are not just repeating a text. You are joining a lineage. You are breathing the same breath as those who came before, entering a current that still flows. And so, the Buddha's silence in the realm of writing was not a void. It was a form of teaching, a message beyond words. It said, "Do not look for me in ink. Look for me in your own direct experience." Today, we live in an age overflowing with words. Countless books bear the name Buddha. His teachings have been translated into every major language, formatted for screens, turned into courses, posters, and quotes. And yet, his most radical teaching remains unchanged. Be a lamp unto yourselves. Work out your liberation with diligence. This is the voice that still speaks, not through books, but through silence. Not through screens, but through seeing. Not through rituals, but through reality itself. The Buddha never wrote because what he gave us was not meant to be read, it was meant to be realized. Let his silence remind us. Let it call us back from the page to the present, from analysis to awareness, from the outer voice to the inner stillness. There, in the space between thoughts, in the breath that observes, in the mind that no longer clings, the Buddha is still speaking. Are you listening?